Natural selection is the driving force behind evolution. Within any species, there is genetic diversity, but not all genetic combinations will be equally viable in a given ecosystem. Natural selection is the process wherein organisms carrying genes more conducive to survival, reproduction, and bringing one's offspring to viability are more likely to successfully reproduce successfully reproducing offspring, thereby increasing the representation of the corresponding genes in subsequent generations. So, for example, a predatory animal that has a unique mutation that causes it to develop more fast-twitch muscle fibers can be expected to outcompete its slower peers. Of course, this isn't a guarantee. If this fleet-of-foot predator is shot by a hunter, well, that'll be the end of that. Over a long time scale, with many generations of organisms reproducing many times, we can see incremental cross-generational changes. Gradually, these changes can become so significant that two organisms from different strata of the same genetic line become so different from one another that they wouldn't recognize each other as being members of the same species, they would not be able to reproduce with each other, and they'd be shocked by the notion that they have even a single common ancestor. This theory of evolution by natural selection, developed by Charles Darwin and built upon ever since, is nearly unanimously accepted within the scientific community and is broadly accepted outside of it. Where it isn't accepted, the barriers tend to be either religious or due to a lack of interest or ability to look into the matter. Understandably, many religious folks have been highly averse to this theory of biological adaptation and speciation. Not only does it conflict with their holy texts, but it opens the door for an increasingly intellectually fulfilled non-theistic worldview. And with that comes some rather scary questions. Are humans a cultural transformation or two away from being no less susceptible to tooth and claw than a deer in the forest? Are we capable of being just as vicious as a bear? And are our lives no more special and no less expendable than either the deer or the bear? Will we ever see our dead grandmother again? Is there any assurance of justice in the world? Is that person really smarter, funnier, stronger, richer, better looking, happier, and more respected than me? And with no redeeming but, that's the end of it? The Catholic Church spent a long time stridently opposing evolutionary theory. Popes, however, eventually came around to accepting it as well as Big Bang cosmology, though with some caveats. They seem to be rather cool with evolutionary and Big Bang theory, just so long as there's a role for God that is maintained. So God is that which set the precondition that allowed for both, perhaps God guided both, and as importantly as anything else, God, and not the material world, is what endowed us with souls. As I've joked before, many Catholics and Catholic authorities are perfectly cool with evolution just so long as it stays the hell away from the soul. But interestingly, Catholics are not the only people who are often cool with evolutionary theory just so long as it stays away from the soul. Something very similar can be said about many academics and lay individuals on the identity politics-oriented left. In this segment of society, it is not at all uncommon to hear mockery of conservative institutions like the Catholic Church, and indeed, the mockery is often quite understandable. It's also not uncommon to hear accusations from the identity politics left, as well as others, toward more conservative social institutions that they are anti-science. Yet, in an interesting instance of something akin to political horseshoe theory, many people from opposing sides of the cultural spectrum, traditionalist right-of-center Catholics on the one hand and progressive left-of-center secularists on the other, seem to be converging on a point of accidental agreement. Naturalistic evolution applies to absolutely everything but what is in between the ears. Apparently, the brain was evolution's Sunday. That was its day of rest. The way this plays out among many on the identity-oriented left and in large segments of academic disciplines like sociology and anthropology and social psychology is via strident opposition to evolutionary psychology. The primary idea behind evolutionary psychology is that evolution, in fact, did not stop at our minds and brains. If we want to understand why our minds work the way they do, we should no more ignore evolutionary biology than if we were trying to figure out why a bird's wings work the way they do. So why do many on the academic and cultural left oppose the notion that evolution shaped our minds? I believe that the most significant reason is the perceived implications of this idea to foundational beliefs that they hold and the negative consequences that could ensue if these beliefs were successfully challenged. And indeed, their concerns here are not without merit. There will always be people who will selectively use scientific ideas to further their own agenda. A very important component of the worldview among those that are hostile towards evolutionary psychology is blank slate theory. This is the notion that our minds and brains are devoid of any character-related or socially relevant structure. Our brains are essentially blank canvases which are written upon by experience as processed by a domain general learning algorithm that, with the exceptions of persons with conditions like Down syndrome, is no better or worse from person to person. So oddly, this does not sound it sounds rather binary in the thinking, very anti-spectrum, which, is notable. But the thing is with the blank slate worldview is it's actually a very hopeful worldview. If it were true, then so long as we structure society so as to give every child the right sort of education and opportunities in home life, every child would be just as able to become the next Michael Jordan, Barack Obama, or Marie Curie. Of course, it would also mean that they're equally predisposed to becoming the next Jeffrey Dahmer or Adolf Hitler, which is all the more reason to ensure good social welfare programs, anti-hate speech policies, and the like. Unfortunately, though, this blank slate theory turns out not to be true, and we've known this for a long time now. We are not all born cognitively or temperamentally equally. Some infants, for example, are more fearful of new people than others, some are more irritable, some more aggressive, and these sorts of early pre-socialization orientations in turn set off cascading positive feedback loops. So for example, imagine you have two infants. One is relatively receptive to new people, whereas the other gets very fearful among unfamiliar faces. The first will smile, giggle, and engage in play when a new person comes to them, which that new person is likely to find validating, fun, and inviting, thereby eliciting more positive interaction with the infant. But the other infant will panic and retreat, which the new person will probably find invalidating and rejecting, and so they will shy away from interacting further with this initially fearful infant. So we have a positive feedback loop. Which of these two infants is going to invite more positive social interactions in the long run? And what sort of developmental trajectory would you expect based on this? We're also not equally cognitively prepared when we exit the womb. IQ and conscientiousness, for example, are highly heritable. There's a reason why you're much more likely to see ads looking for sperm donors in a university newspaper than on the walls of an unemployment office or prison. Apparently, we're all evolutionary psychologists at the sperm bank. But why is the notion of cognitive and temperamental heritability so scary to many on the left? Well, for starters, it invites a fairly dismal worldview. The child of a poor family really isn't as likely to develop the character and competence needed to be a CEO as is the child of two doctors, and no amount of social programming is likely to come close to bridging this gap. Not only is this psychologically defeating, it also can be used as an argument against programs to help underprivileged or otherwise struggling children, which is scary. And the thing is that some of the kids of the poor really will, ascend up excellently if you give them opportunities. So there's more than one reason to be afraid of the kind of policies that this kind of idea can foster. Further, it opens up the door to biologically based sex differences. If gender gaps on executive boards, in STEM fields, and professional sports are all due to sexism, well then in principle they can be fixed by social programming and consciousness raising and the like. But if there are biological bases that explain a good chunk of these gaps, then maybe there's no real getting around them. And so once again, in addition to being psychologically defeating, this sort of knowledge could also be used to justify maintaining the status quo, to justify parents raising their sons and daughters in restrictive, gender-typical ways, to justify institutional sexism. These are legitimate things to be worried about and opposed to. Stepping it up a level, there's the study of race differences in socially important areas like intelligence, extroversion, and aggression. It would not be surprising to me in the slightest if there are actually average group level differences in these sorts of areas. The races did experience periods of isolation from one another. There may have been bottleneck effects. We know that there are other average differences in things like susceptibility to sickle cell anemia, average differences in height and size, ratios of fast to slow twitch muscle fibers, and so on. So why couldn't there be cognitive or temperamental differences too? Further, just as there are scholars motivated to disprove such differences, there will also be other scholars motivated to prove them. And once backed by science, couldn't the notion of race-based differences be used to justify racism? Once again, dismal and dangerous. And then, of course, in the most extreme cases, you have people like Adolf Hitler trying to bolster their bigotries with ideologically driven science. These are valid fears. But just as moral and social concerns have driven many religious folk toward rejecting well-established science, this is also happening among many on the academic and cultural left, some of whom are the first to shout out that we trust the science. There are also other reasons why people on the academic left distrust evolutionary psychological theory. For example, there have been evolutionary arguments about why men find women with hourglass figures more attractive, but these have been rebutted by arguments from times in the past where the most sought-after women were obese. However, there is a key difference here. If you go back to those times where food was much more scarce, obesity was a signal that you had access to food, which spoke well of your standing and that of your family, and so it was a good sexual signal. Now, however, food is plentiful, and so obesity is no longer at all a positive social signal. It's also not at all hard to find silly cases of evolutionary psychological reasoning. One funny case was offered by biologist Jerry Coyne, who made the joke that the reason semen doesn't taste good is that if it did, women would take it in orally and not vaginally, and so our ancestors would have Darwined themselves out of existence. This was a parody of the kind of evolutionary psychological arguments you can sometimes find out there. And then, of course, they've heard plenty of dismissive anti-evo psych jokes by sociologists and other critics. For example, are men less tidy than women on average because they didn't inherit the cleaning your room gene as often as women did? This is obviously, it's a ridiculous sort of argument. Here's a more sensible evolutionary psychological argument for this average group difference. Females are the reproductive bottlenecks of any community. So the safety of an individual female from disease is usually more important to the survival of the tribe and thus the genes than that of an individual male. In fact, their safety from any threat is particularly important, which could possibly predispose them to having a higher degree of aversion to disorder in their environment in a general sense. Compare that to our male ancestors, who would have to deal with predatory animals, predatory humans, and they may have to fight to obtain sexual access or to defend their families. So it makes sense that they would have a greater tolerance for chaos and disorder than females on average. And then another argument is that females on average spent more time with young infants, and so it would make sense that they be more intolerant of, say, uncleanliness, because their infants would have underdeveloped immune systems. So ultimately, let's start wrapping this up. I think more nuance is needed. Let's say that there actually is an average difference in some aspect of cognitive capacity between black and white people, or males and females on average. Okay, but the person in front of you, whoever they are, is an individual. Just because you know what the bell curves look like doesn't mean that you know where any particular individual finds themselves on their curve. If you want to know what a particular person can do, you have to get to know them. I don't care what the stats say. If I'm on the floor of a burning building, I'd rather have Ronda Rousey come rescue me than Woody Allen. If Visa needs a new risk analyst, they'd be better off with a woman mathematician than some dude. We also need more understanding and nuance in how we view people on the other side. If you're on my side on this, know that not everyone on the cultural left is stupid or stubborn. If you're on the cultural left side on this issue, know that not everyone on my side is stupid, stubborn, or just trying to justify their bigotry. All right, thanks for listening. If you're looking for more intentionally balanced analysis, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.